This is a whooping crane, one of only 335 alive in the world today. In 1954, the population had fallen as low as 21 individuals. 20 years ago, an ingenious scheme was initiated to boost its numbers. Despite its failure, the scheme paved the way for an ongoing preservation program that is slowly succeeding in increasing the whooping crane's numbers. When America's virgin wilderness was claimed by early colonists, most of the whooping crane's breeding grounds were drained and ploughed. The birds didn't move on, they just began to die out. Having studied the cranes from 1968, Rod Druin formulated a plan to increase their numbers by introducing some of their chicks to sandhill crane foster parents. The scheme would use the principle of follow my leader. The conservationists' work was made more difficult by a mystery which surrounded the surviving whooping cranes. No one knew where they nested. The last previously known nest was in 1922, but in an area long since forsaken by the birds. Then, in 1955, another nesting area was discovered in Wood Buffalo National Park in the Northwest Territories of Canada. One reason for the crane's very slow recovery is that although it lays 2 eggs, it usually only manages to raise 1 chick. Pairs which successfully raise both chicks often separate their offspring to avoid conflict over food. Competition between unseparated chicks is inevitable and may result in only one surviving to adulthood. A single chick per pair does little to boost the crane's annual total. The Hooper's migration route over 3,800 kilometers from Canada to Aransas on the Texas coast passed over what used to be their prime breeding areas. But although much of the territory was carefully protected, the birds showed no sign of nesting there again. Although Aransas was only one of several traditional wintering grounds, cranes hadn't been sighted at any other refuge. Research showed that whooping cranes only bred where they were hatched. They also returned to winter only at the place where their parents had guided them in their first year. This adherence to custom prevented the cranes from recolonizing their old territories. The Texas islands and salt marshes were closely protected. Today, the present total of migrant whooping cranes stands at just over 150. Given their past history, their annual growth at 4% is a significant achievement. Aransas provides a wealth of food for the birds, mostly clams and other invertebrates found in the mud. All the birds from Wood Buffalo National Park have always spent the winter feeding here. Aransas lies on the Gulf Intercoastal Waterway, used daily by barges carrying chemicals, oil, and natural gas. Past experience has shown that no floating carrier can be 100% safe. If just one of these oil tankers was breached, the cranes would lose their only wintering grounds, and then the world would lose the whooping cranes. A daring solution to the problem was developed by Fred Bard, a Canadian biologist in the 1950s. He suggested moving part of the population, but at that time too little was known about the cranes to justify the risk. Instead, biologists concentrated on rearing them in captivity. By 1974, a flock of 19 birds had been built up at Patuxent Wildlife Research Centre by incubating eggs taken from nests in Wood Buffalo Park. Because whooping cranes hatch 2 eggs, but usually rear only 1 chick, collecting 1 egg from each nest before they hatched had little effect on the wild population. The captive birds courted, formed pairs and laid eggs, but then the researchers had only limited success in rearing their chicks. Now most of those problems have been overcome, but in 1975 Fred Bard's original idea began to take on an importance. Like many great ideas, it was very simple. It depended on a close relative of the hooper, the sandhill crane, which breeds at Gray's Lake in Idaho. It's a national wildlife refuge, just under 9,000 hectares of well-protected wetlands. From there, the sandhill cranes migrate first to Monte Vista in Colorado, another protected refuge. Shooting is strictly controlled during limited periods. Hunters are allowed to shoot only certain species and only in certain numbers. For the rest of the time, Monte Vista is a sanctuary. After 2 to 3 weeks here, the sandhill cranes then fly to Bosque del Apache in New Mexico. The total journey is only 1,200 kilometers, less than a third of the distance of the whooping crane's journey to Texas. Because the 2 species lead very similar lives, Bard's idea was to introduce whooping cranes into the sandhill crane population. Like hoopers, sandhill cranes are strictly traditional in their use of migration routes and wintering grounds. The sandhills share Bosque del Apache with other migrants, including ducks and snow geese. For 6 years, from 1968, 2 biologists from the University of Idaho had been studying all aspects of this sandhill crane population. Rod Druin was already beginning to confirm Bard's suggestion that sandhill cranes would make ideal foster parents for young whooping cranes. Cranes become imprinted as chicks. They follow the first moving object they see, which is normally one of their parents. Because of this, the transplanted hoopers would have to be taken to Gray's Lake as eggs. Druin had already made detailed studies of the sandhill crane's nesting behavior. Now that information became invaluable. Druin compared the nesting records of all the sandhill pairs to select the most successful as foster parents for the newcomers. Like hoopers, sandhill cranes usually rear only 1 of the 2 eggs that hatch. An important early task was to determine whether sandhill parents would continue to incubate the remaining egg if one of their clutch was taken. Druin had to check that the intrusion and disturbance wouldn't scare the birds off the nest altogether. Although they flew off as he arrived, they soon returned, and they brooded their single eggs as tightly as when there were 2. When all the questions had been satisfactorily answered, in the spring of 1975, the operation started. Druin removed 1 egg from each of the 14 most successful nests in the refuge. The fertile sandhill eggs would be hatched in Patuxent as part of their own fostering program. The remaining egg in each nest was to be replaced with a whooping crane egg, and in this first trial, they would be flown from Wood Buffalo. having marked the remaining sandhill egg in each nest, a necessary precaution given the speed at which you would have to work later, Druin was ready. A few days later, the precious Canadian eggs arrived. They'd been flown by Air Force jet across the United States and then by helicopter from the nearest airfield to Gray's Lake. They were transported in insulated suitcases by Canadian biologists who took great care of their important cargo. Each suitcase had contained half of the eggs during transit to reduce the risk of damage. Now, 12 of the eggs were carefully transferred into one suitcase, and the empty one would be used to collect the sandhill eggs. The temperature was maintained in a very simple way. Each case had hot water bottles in the bottom. On the Air Force plane, they'd been kept topped up with hot water from the coffee machine. It only remained to deposit the eggs on the nests as quickly and efficiently as possible to minimize the disturbance to the birds. Sandhill and whooping crane eggs are very similar in size and colour, and they have the same incubation period. The whooping crane eggs have been collected from nests where they'd been laid at approximately the same time as the foster parent's own clutch. When the last egg was in place, all the biologists could do was wait until the fostered eggs hatched. Later in the season, after 9 out of 14 of the transplanted eggs had hatched in their foster nests, Rod Druin visited them to ring the chicks, if he could find them. Many whooping crane chicks die in their first 30 days from natural causes. If they survived this first month, they had a fair chance of reaching adulthood. Before they could fly, the chicks were given individual coloured bands as well as numbered metal rings, so that they could be identified later from a distance. Throughout the summer, Druin caught occasional glimpses of the young hoopers. 5 died from natural causes, but 4 were still alive in early October when the sandhill cranes left on migration to their winter grounds. This time, the large wetland area of Monte Vista was watched more closely than usual by biologists looking for the young hoopers. Somewhere among the grey flights of sandhills, they were looking for a flash of pure white that would indicate a whooping crane in its first adult plumage. The cranes arrived, but there was no trace of a hooper. The biologists were confident that they would arrive eventually, guided by their foster parents on which they were imprinted. The survival of only 4 out of 14 eggs was not as great a disappointment as it might sound. In the wild population at Wood Buffalo, only 1 in 4 eggs produces a migrating young bird. That's 4 out of 16. The experimental population actually had a slightly higher average than the natural one. Given these statistics, it was strange one hadn't arrived yet. Then, to everyone's relief, the first young whooping crane appeared. Before long, all 4 of the summer's survivors were accounted for. It really began to seem as if the experiment would succeed. The sandhill cranes accepted the different-looking white birds in their midst, and the whooping cranes seemed perfectly at ease with the different species, because hoopers had imprinted on their sandhill crane foster parents very successfully. When the time came to move on to Bosque del Apache, the hoopers would undergo a test of their adaptive ability. Whooping cranes in Texas fed on invertebrates from the mudflats, but wintering sandhills fed on grain. Would the hoopers mimic their foster parents' behavior or develop independent feeding methods of their own? In fact, some of the earliest records of whooping cranes by the first settlers in North America mention seeing them feeding in grain fields, and these youngsters soon accommodated cereal into their normal diet. Although this new population was safe from the man-made dangers of the Texas coastal waterways, it wasn't immune from the natural dangers of the sandhill's winter home. Bosque del Apache, with its huge wintering flocks, was very attractive to predators, for obvious reasons. The number of coyotes rose as sensitive management of the refuge increased the number of birds using it. Natural predators had no compunction about eating any individual, even if it did represent the rebirth of its species. After the first experimental hooper reached Bosque in 1975, the transplants were repeated annually. In 1977, during the long drought, coyotes were able to cross to the islands where the birds normally gather, and many sandhills died, but no whooping crane was caught. Throughout the first winter, the 4 pioneers survived. The next turning point in the crane's year came in April, when the mature adults start their dancing display, preparing for the breeding season. Although this didn't involve the juveniles, it raised an important question for the future of the young hoopers. If young birds learned their behavior from seeing adults displaying, the hoopers might take sandhill cranes as their models, and therefore as mates when they reach maturity. At Aransas, the wild hoopers never saw a sandhill crane in the winter, but the hoopers at Gray's Lake had been deliberately imprinted on sandhills. The two species can breed together, producing hybrid offspring. Under natural conditions, they're prevented from crossbreeding by subtle differences in courtship behavior, as well as by using different breeding and wintering grounds. In every other respect, the lives of the two species are so similar as to be effectively interchangeable. As the Aransas hoopers ate their last Texas clams and prepared to return to Canada, the Bosque sandhills and their whooping crane foster chicks were taking their last corn and setting off for Idaho. Maintaining the differences in courtship display was absolutely vital in keeping the new whooping crane population intact. This was the one point in the operation when the scientists had to rely on the birds themselves. They had believed that the birds' essential similarity in behavior would make the first part of the scheme possible. But would the new hoopers now continue to mimic their foster species in courtship behavior too? At Gray's Lake in the summer of 1979, when they were 4 years old, two of the transplanted whooping cranes showed signs of territorial behavior and temporary pairing between themselves, not with sandhills. But sadly, this promising beginning was not to continue in the long term. Most of the hoopers transplanted in later years failed to return to the breeding site where they were reared. More significantly, the first part of the operation ultimately misfired. The transplanted cranes failed to breed with their own kind because of their imprinting on their sandhill foster parents. The pioneer work of Rod Druin and his colleagues was daring and unorthodox. Despite its eventual failure, the fostering scheme led to other methods of preserving this highly endangered bird. As these new efforts continued, the cranes started to increase their numbers. Captive reared whooping cranes have been used to introduce a non-migratory wild population in Florida, now numbering over 60. A whooping crane reintroduction plan to repopulate the bird's ancestral range in Canada may begin soon after the millennium. It would be a success story indeed if people, the primary reason for the whooping crane's initial demise, were to be the architects of the survival of this great white bird that so nearly vanished from the American skies.